The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the pre-op room as 26-year-old Haze Roberts lay on the gurney, her auburn hair splayed against the sterile white pillow. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence where voices should have been, voices of family, friends, anyone who cared enough to show up when it mattered most. Dr. Patricia Caldwell had seen many patients go into emergency surgery, but something about the empty chairs in the waiting room and the young woman's forced, brave smile made her pause at the doorway. Little did she know that her simple question, "Where is your family, Miss Roberts?" would unravel a web of betrayal and neglect that had been 26 years in the making.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Haze Roberts had always been the invisible child in a family that thrived on appearances. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Willowbrook Heights, Connecticut, she lived in a pristine colonial house with perfectly manicured lawns and a family that looked picture perfect from the outside. Her mother, Victoria Roberts, was a successful real estate agent who had built her reputation on selling dreams to other families while somehow never quite managing to create a warm home for her own. Her father, Richard Roberts, was a corporate lawyer who spent more time in his downtown Hartford office than he did at the dinner table. The Roberts family had always operated on an unspoken hierarchy. At the top sat Haze's older brother, Marcus, the golden child who could do no wrong. 3 years older than Haze, Marcus had inherited their father's commanding presence and their mother's sharp business acumen. He'd graduated summa cum laude from Yale, landed a prestigious position at a Manhattan investment firm, and married Sophia Whitman, whose family owned half of Greenwich's waterfront properties. Every family gathering revolved around Marcus's latest achievements, his newest acquisition, or his expanding social network. Then there was Haze's younger sister, Lily, who at 23 had already established herself as the family's artistic darling. Beautiful, talented, and charming in a way that made everyone gravitate toward her, Lily could paint, sing, and dance her way into anyone's heart. Their parents proudly displayed her artwork throughout the house and never missed an opportunity to mention her recent gallery showing in New York or her acceptance into a prestigious MFA program. And then there was Haze, caught somewhere in the middle, neither the accomplished firstborn nor the creative baby of the family. She had tried for years to find her place in the Roberts family dynamic. In high school, she'd thrown herself into academics, hoping to match Marcus's achievements. But her solid B+ average and state university acceptance letter had been met with polite congratulations that felt more like consolations. She'd attempted to connect with Lily through art classes and music lessons, but her modest talents paled in comparison to her sister's natural gifts. By the time Haze graduated from the University of Connecticut with a degree in social work, she had accepted her role as the family's supporting cast member. She was the one who remembered birthdays, organized holiday gatherings, and made sure everyone else's needs were met. She was reliable, responsible, and remarkably easy to overlook. After college, while Marcus was climbing corporate ladders and Lily was painting her way through Europe on their parents' dime, Haze had moved into a modest apartment in Hartford's West End and taken a job at Riverside Community Center. She worked with at-risk teenagers, helping them navigate family troubles, educational challenges, and the kind of emotional neglect she understood all too well. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days helping other people's children feel valued and heard, while her own family barely noticed when she missed Sunday dinners. Her apartment on Maple Street was a far cry from the Roberts family estate. The building, a converted Victorian house, had thin walls and creaky floors, but it was hers. She'd furnished it with secondhand finds and plants she'd nursed back to health. Rescuing things seemed to be her specialty. Her living room walls were covered, not with expensive art like her childhood home, but with thank you cards from the kids at the community center. photos from volunteer trips to build homes in rural Connecticut, and a few of her own amateur photography prints from weekend hikes in the state parks. Haze had learned to find fulfillment in small moments and quiet accomplishments. She took pride in helping 17-year-old Jamal get his GED after dropping out of high school. She celebrated when 15-year-old Maria found the courage to report her abusive stepfather. She felt genuinely useful when she organized the center's annual holiday toy drive that brought joy to dozens of local families. These victories never made it into conversations at family gatherings, but they sustained her in ways that her family's approval never had. Her personal life had followed a similar pattern of settling for less than she deserved. She'd been dating Trevor Mitchell for almost 2 years, a relationship that had started with promise but had gradually settled into comfortable routine. Trevor worked in IT for an insurance company and was perfectly nice in that utterly forgettable way. He remembered to text good morning, brought wine to dinner parties, and never caused drama. He also never seemed particularly excited to see her, never planned surprises, and had a habit of checking his phone during their conversations. The relationship had reached that uncomfortable plateau where they'd been together long enough that everyone expected an engagement announcement, but neither of them seemed motivated to take that step. Trevor talked vaguely about their future together, but his plans always seemed to involve what they should do rather than what he wanted to do with her specifically. Haze had begun to suspect that she was more of a placeholder than a partner, someone steady and reliable while he figured out what he really wanted from life. Her family's response to Trevor had been typically lukewarm. Victoria had made polite inquiries about his career prospects and family background, but never seemed to remember details from one conversation to the next. Richard had shaken his hand firmly at family gatherings and then promptly forgotten his name. Marcus had been cordially dismissive in that way successful older brothers perfected, while Lily had been sweetly distracted, usually checking her phone or talking about her latest artistic project during the few times they'd all been together. The Sunday dinners at the Roberts house had become exercises in endurance for Haze. She would arrive punctually at 2:00, bringing dessert or flowers as she'd been raised to do, and settle into her usual spot at the dining room table, the chair that seemed to exist in everyone's peripheral vision. The conversations flowed around her like water around a stone, touching on Marcus's latest business deals, Lily's upcoming exhibitions, their parents' social events, and vacation plans that somehow never included her. Haze had developed coping mechanisms over the years. She'd learned to ask the right questions to keep others talking about themselves, deflecting attention from her own life in ways that felt supportive rather than self-deprecating. She'd mastered the art of being present without being noticed, contributing without taking center stage. It was a skill that served her well in her work with teenagers, but it had become a prison in her personal relationships. The gradual realization that she was living her life for other people's comfort rather than her own happiness had been creeping up on her for months. She'd started having dreams about traveling alone, taking photography classes, maybe even applying for that master's program in counseling psychology she'd been researching in secret. She'd begun to notice how often she said yes when she meant maybe and it's fine when she meant this hurts. 3 weeks before the surgery that would change everything, Haze had experienced what she would later recognize as her first real moment of clarity. She'd been sitting in her car outside the Roberts house after another Sunday dinner where she'd listened to 2 hours of conversation about Marcus's promotion and Lily's acceptance into a summer residency program in Italy. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Trevor asking if she wanted to grab dinner at their usual place, the same Italian restaurant they'd been going to every Tuesday for 8 months. For the first time in her adult life, Haze had typed back, "Not tonight," without offering an alternative plan or an elaborate explanation. She'd driven home, ordered Thai food from a place she'd been wanting to try, and spent the evening researching graduate programs and photography workshops. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt like the first authentic decision she'd made in years. That night, lying in her bed surrounded by college brochures and travel magazines, Haze had made a quiet promise to herself. She was going to start living for her own approval instead of waiting for everyone else's. She was going to speak up, take up space, and stop apologizing for having needs and opinions. She was going to figure out who she was when she wasn't busy being who everyone else needed her to be. She had no way of knowing that in less than 3 weeks, a sudden medical emergency would test every relationship in her life and reveal exactly how little her family had invested in the daughter who had spent 26 years investing everything in them. The revelation would be devastating, but it would also be the catalyst that finally set her free.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The morning of October 15th started like any other Wednesday for Haze Roberts. Her alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m. and she rolled out of bed to the sound of rain pattering against her apartment windows. She'd always been an early riser, a habit formed in childhood when getting up before everyone else meant having the house to herself for a precious hour of peace. She made her usual breakfast, steel-cut oats with berries and a cup of coffee that was probably too strong, while scrolling through emails from work. The Riverside Community Center was in the middle of organizing their annual Halloween fundraiser, and Haze's inbox was full of vendor confirmations, volunteer schedules, and budget updates. As the center's program coordinator, she wore a dozen different hats: event planner, counselor, administrative assistant, and sometimes even janitor when the need arose. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful in ways that her family had never quite understood. She was particularly excited about this year's fundraiser because they'd managed to secure the Hartford Civic Center's smaller auditorium for the event. Local businesses had donated prizes for a silent auction, and several of her teenage participants had volunteered to perform, everything from spoken word poetry to breakdancing demonstrations. For many of these kids, it would be the first time they'd performed in front of a supportive audience that included their families. After breakfast, Haze pulled on her favorite burgundy sweater and black jeans, grabbed her oversized tote bag that served as both purse and mobile office, and headed out into the drizzly Hartford morning. Her Honda Civic, a 2019 model that she'd bought used and was still making payments on, started on the second try, a small victory that put her in a good mood despite the gray weather. The drive to the community center took her through some of Hartford's most challenging neighborhoods, areas where poverty and opportunity existed side by side in ways that never failed to remind her why her work mattered. She passed the elementary school where 8-year-old Destiny Williams attended 3rd grade, the same little girl whose mother worked 2 jobs and relied on the community center's after-school program to keep her daughter safe until she could pick her up at 7 p.m. She drove by the apartment complex where Marcus Thompson lived with his grandmother, a 17-year-old who'd been coming to the center since he was 12, and had just received early acceptance to Central Connecticut State University with the scholarship help Haze had spent months helping him secure. These small victories sustained her more than any family dinner ever had. Haze arrived at the Riverside Community Center at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before her official start time, another habit that had served her well in a job where crisis management was part of the daily routine. The building, a converted warehouse in Hartford's Asylum Hill neighborhood, wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside it hummed with the energy of possibility. The walls were covered with artwork created by participants, college acceptance letters, and photos from community events that stretch back nearly a decade. Her morning started with a staff meeting where they discussed the upcoming fundraiser, reviewed case files for several at-risk youth, and planned the week's programming. Haze's supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, was a former social worker who had built the center from the ground up and had become something of a mentor to Haze over the past 4 years. Janet had noticed Haze's natural ability to connect with teenagers who had been written off by other adults, and she'd been encouraging Haze to consider pursuing her master's degree in counseling. "You have a gift," Janet had told her just last week. "These kids trust you in ways they don't trust other adults. You should think about what you could do with some formal training behind that intuition." The conversation had planted a seed that Haze found herself thinking about more and more. Maybe it was time to bet on herself the way she'd been betting on everyone else for so many years.
By 10 a.m., the center was full of activity. The computer lab buzzed with adults working on their GEDs, while the main room hosted a job skills workshop for teenagers. Haze spent the morning moving between different programs, checking in with participants, troubleshooting technical issues, and fielding phone calls from parents, schools, and social services. Around 11:30, she was reviewing vendor contracts for the fundraiser when she felt the first twinge of pain in her lower abdomen. It was sharp but brief, like a muscle cramp, and she dismissed it as the result of too much coffee and not enough breakfast. She'd been skipping meals lately, caught up in the excitement of planning the fundraiser and trying to balance her relationship with Trevor, who had been increasingly distant over the past few weeks. The pain returned 20 minutes later, more intense this time, radiating from her lower right side upward toward her ribs. She pressed her hand against her abdomen and tried to continue working, but the discomfort was becoming harder to ignore. She'd always prided herself on having a high pain tolerance, a necessity in a family where showing weakness was discouraged, but this felt different from anything she'd experienced before. By noon, she was having trouble concentrating. The pain came in waves, each one more intense than the last, accompanied by a nausea that made her regret the morning coffee. She excused herself from a meeting with the fundraiser committee and went to the small staff bathroom, hoping that whatever was wrong would pass.
Looking at herself in the mirror, Haze was startled by how pale she'd become. Her usual healthy complexion had taken on a grayish tinge, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. She splashed cold water on her face and tried to give herself a pep talk, but another wave of pain doubled her over, leaving her gripping the sink and fighting back the urge to vomit. Janet found her there 10 minutes later, after Haze had failed to return to the committee meeting. "Haze, are you okay?" Janet's voice carried the kind of concern that came from years of working with people in crisis. "I'm fine," Haze started to say, but another spasm of pain caught her mid-sentence, and she had to steady herself against the wall. Janet took one look at her and made the decision that would change everything. "No, you're not fine. Something's wrong. We're getting you to a hospital." I can't leave now," Haze protested weakly. "The fundraiser meeting." "The fundraiser will be fine. You will not be if we ignore this." Janet's tone brooked no argument. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No ambulance," Haze managed to say. "Too expensive. I'll drive myself." "Like hell you will." Janet was already pulling out her phone. "You can barely stand up." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of increasing pain and decreasing control. The ambulance arrived, and Haze found herself being loaded onto a stretcher while trying to give Janet instructions about the fundraiser, the vendor payments, and the dozen other responsibilities she was leaving behind. Even in the middle of a medical emergency, her first instinct was to make sure other people's needs were met. Janet promised to handle everything and squeezed Haze's hand as the paramedics prepared to close the ambulance doors. "Call your family," she said. "Call Trevor. You shouldn't be alone right now." As the ambulance pulled away from the community center, Haze realized she was facing something she'd never really confronted before, a situation where she needed other people to take care of her. The thought was almost as terrifying as the pain that was now radiating through her entire abdomen. She managed to call Trevor first, her hands shaking as she dialed his number. The call went straight to voicemail. He was probably in a meeting. She left a brief message explaining that she was on her way to Mercy General Hospital and asking him to meet her there. She called her mother, Victoria. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Haze left a similar message, trying to keep the panic out of her voice, even as another wave of pain made her gasp. She tried her father next, then Marcus, then Lily. All voicemails. All brief, urgent messages asking for someone, anyone, to come to the hospital. By the time the ambulance arrived at Mercy General, Haze was barely conscious. The pain had reached a level that made rational thought impossible, and she was vaguely aware of being rushed through automatic doors into the bright chaos of the emergency room. Voices swirled around her, medical terminology she didn't understand, questions she couldn't focus on long enough to answer. Dr. Patricia Caldwell, the attending physician, took one look at Haze's symptoms and ordered immediate tests. Blood work, CT scans, and physical examination that confirmed her suspicions. Acute appendicitis with signs of potential rupture. This wasn't something that could wait for morning or be treated with medication.
Haze needed emergency surgery, and she needed it now. As they prepared her for the operating room, Haze kept checking her phone, expecting to see missed calls or text messages from her family. Nothing. The silence was somehow more painful than the appendicitis, a different kind of emergency that she was only beginning to understand. The last thing she remembered before the anesthesia took effect was giving the hospital her emergency contact information and realizing with startling clarity that she wasn't sure anyone would actually come if they called.
The recovery room at Mercy General Hospital existed in that liminal space between sleep and consciousness, where time moved like honey and reality felt negotiable. Haze Roberts drifted in and out of awareness, her mind foggy from anesthesia and pain medication, but gradually becoming aware of several uncomfortable truths. First, her abdomen felt like it had been sliced open and stitched back together, which she dimly remembered was exactly what had happened. The appendectomy had been successful, but it had been a close call. Dr. Caldwell had explained, in those careful medical terms that meant you almost died, that her appendix had been on the verge of rupturing when they removed it. Second, the chair beside her hospital bed was empty. Haze's eyes focused slowly on the institutional furniture. A standard hospital visitor's chair, upholstered in that peculiar shade of blue-green that seemed designed to discourage long stays. It sat vacant next to her bed, a silent testimony to something she was only beginning to process through the haze of medication. A nurse appeared at her bedside, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and scrubs decorated with cartoon cats. Her name tag read, Denise Williams, RN. "Good morning, honey," Denise said, checking the monitors that surrounded Haze's bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Haze managed, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. "What time is it?" "About 8:30 in the morning, Thursday morning," Denise clarified, adjusting Haze's IV drip. "You came out of surgery around midnight, and you've been sleeping off the anesthesia since then." Thursday morning. The surgery had been Wednesday evening, which meant she'd been in the hospital for almost 24 hours. Haze's eyes drifted again to the empty chair, then to her phone on the bedside table. The screen showed 17 missed calls from Janet at the community center, but nothing from her family. "Has anyone called asking about me?" Haze asked, though she already knew the answer from the expression that crossed Denise's face. "The hospital tried to reach your emergency contacts. We left messages, but..." She trailed off, the silence speaking volumes. Haze closed her eyes, trying to process this information through the fog of medication and exhaustion. Her family knew she was here. The hospital had called them. They had chosen not to come. "Your supervisor from work has called several times. Janet Rodriguez? She seems very worried about you. And there's been someone calling from your apartment complex. I think your neighbor?" Mrs. Chen from 2B probably saw the ambulance and was checking on her. A 70-year-old woman she barely knew had shown more concern than her own family. Over the next few hours, as the anesthesia wore off and her thinking became clearer, Haze began to make phone calls. Not to her family, she wasn't ready for that conversation yet, but to the people who actually seemed to care about her well-being. Janet answered on the first ring. "Haze, thank God, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been surgically rearranged, but alive." Haze found herself smiling despite everything. "How's the fundraiser prep going?" "Do not even think about work right now," Janet said firmly. "Marcus and Destiny made a giant get-well card for you, and half the kids at the center have been asking when you're coming back. But right now, your only job is to get better." The contrast was stark and painful. The teenagers she worked with, kids who had been abandoned and overlooked by the adults in their lives, were worried about her. Meanwhile, her own family hadn't managed to return a single phone call. Trevor finally called around noon, his voice carrying that peculiar tone of guilt that meant he knew he'd screwed up. "Haze, I'm so sorry. I was in back-to-back meetings yesterday and didn't check my phone until this morning. Are you okay? Should I come to the hospital? I had emergency surgery last night. My appendix almost ruptured." There was a long pause. Jesus, I'm so sorry. I'll leave work right now. And no, Haze interrupted, and the word felt strange in her mouth. She couldn't remember the last time she'd said no to Trevor about anything. What do you mean, don't? I mean, don't come because you feel guilty. Don't come because it's what you think you're supposed to do. He stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in the acoustic panels. You didn't know because you didn't answer your phone. You didn't answer because whatever meeting you were in was more important than the possibility that someone you claim to care about might need you.
The silence stretched between them, filled with 2 years of accumulated resentments and unspoken truths. "We should talk about this when you're feeling better," Trevor said finally. "No," Haze said again, and this time the word felt powerful. "We should talk about this now, when I'm clear-headed and done pretending that being treated like an afterthought is normal." She could hear Trevor's breathing on the other end of the line, could practically feel his discomfort with confrontation. He'd always preferred to smooth things over, to avoid difficult conversations until they've disappeared into the background noise of their relationship. "Look, I know you're upset, and you have every right to be, but maybe we shouldn't make any big decisions while you're in the hospital." "I'm not making decisions," Haze said. "I'm finally admitting truths I've been avoiding for months." After she hung up, Haze lay in the hospital bed and thought about patterns. How many times had she been the one to call first, to check in, to remember birthdays and anniversaries and important events? How many times had she been the one to adjust her schedule, change her plans, accommodate everyone else's needs? Dr. Caldwell stopped by during afternoon rounds, her waistcoat crisp despite what had clearly been a long day. She was younger than Haze had expected, maybe mid-30s, with short dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't have time for nonsense. "How are you feeling, Miss Roberts?" "Physically, much better. Emotionally, that's more complicated." Dr. Caldwell pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down, something that surprised Haze. Most doctors she'd encountered preferred to maintain their authority by standing. "I noticed you've been alone since the surgery. That's unusual for someone your age." Haze felt tears prick at her eyes, the first ones she'd allowed herself since waking up. "My family is busy." "Too busy for emergency surgery?" There was something about Dr. Caldwell's tone, not judgmental, but genuinely confused, that made Haze realize how abnormal her situation really was. "I've always been the one who takes care of everyone else. I think I forgot that sometimes other people are supposed to take care of me." Dr. Caldwell nodded. "In my experience, people who are really good at giving care often never learn how to ask for it, or they learn not to expect it." "Is that a medical opinion?" "It's a human observation. I've seen a lot of patients over the years, and the ones who recover fastest usually have people in their corner, not because the support makes them heal physically faster, but because it gives them a reason to prioritize their own well-being." After Dr. Caldwell left, Haze spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about what recovery meant. Not just from surgery, but from 26 years of making herself small so everyone else could feel big. Evening came, and with it visiting hours. Haze watched other patients receive flowers, balloons, and worried relatives. She listened to conversations in the hallway, family members discussing care plans and arguing about who would stay overnight. Around 7 p.m., her phone rang. Her mother's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, Haze felt a surge of hope. "Haze, darling, I just got your message. How are you feeling?" "I had emergency surgery. My ampex almost burst." "Oh my, that sounds serious. Are you all right?" "I'm recovering." "Where were you yesterday? The hospital called." There was a pause, and Haze could hear background noise. Restaurant sounds, clinking glasses, muted conversation.
Well, you know how it is. Your father and I had that charity dinner for the Hartford Historical Society, and then today was packed with showings. October is such a busy season in real estate. A charity dinner? Property showings? Haze closed her eyes and felt something shift inside her chest, like a gear clicking into place. I could have died, Mom. Don't be so dramatic, sweetheart. You said you're fine. I said I'm recovering. That's not the same thing. Well, the important thing is that you're okay now. When are you getting out? Will you need help at home? For the first time in her life, Haze recognized the question for what it was. Not an offer to help, but a request for information to determine how much inconvenience her situation might cause. I'll be fine, Haze said, and realized she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with her Ampex. Good. Well, I should go. Your father is waiting and we have early showings tomorrow. After her mother hung up, Haze sat in the growing darkness of her hospital room and made a decision that would change the rest of her life. She was done waiting for other people to show up for her. She was done making excuses for people who treated her like an option rather than a priority. She was done living her life in the margins of other people's stories. Tomorrow, she would start writing her own.
3 days after her discharge from Mercy General, Haze Roberts sat in her Maple Street apartment, surrounded by get-well cards from the community center kids, and a reality that felt both liberating and terrifying. The decision to stop waiting for other people to show up was easier to make in a hospital bed than it was to execute in real life, where every relationship carried years of established patterns and expectations. The first obstacle came disguised as concern. Trevor had been calling and texting constantly since their hospital conversation, oscillating between apologies and accusations, between promises to do better, and suggestions that she was being unreasonable. On Saturday morning, he showed up at her apartment with coffee from her favorite cafe and the kind of earnest expression that had probably worked on her before. "We need to talk," he said, settling into her living room chair without waiting for an invitation. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand." Haze, who was still moving carefully due to her surgical incisions, remained standing by the window. Something about his positioning, comfortable and entitled to space in her apartment, irritated her in a way it never had before. "What situation is that?" she asked. "You ending our relationship over a misunderstanding." "Trevor, you didn't answer your phone when I was being rushed to emergency surgery. Then you suggested we wait to have difficult conversations until I was feeling better, as if having standards is a symptom of anesthesia." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd once found endearing but now recognized as a manipulation tactic. The overwhelmed nice guy who couldn't understand why everyone was being so unreasonable. "I made a mistake, I admit that, but throwing away 2 years because of one bad day seems extreme." "It wasn't one bad day. It was a pattern of me not being a priority that became impossible to ignore when I actually needed you to prioritize me." Trevor leaned forward, switching to what she privately called his reasonable voice, the tone he used when he wanted to make her feel like she was overreacting. "Look, I know you're going through something with your family right now, and maybe you're taking it out on me, but we're good together. We work." The phrase, "we work," hit her like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was so perfectly mediocre. They worked. Like a reliable appliance or a functional arrangement, not like people who brought out the best in each other, who challenged each other to grow, who created something better together than they were apart. "Working isn't enough anymore," Haze said quietly. "Since when?" "Since I almost died and realized that I've been settling for good enough in every area of my life." Trevor stood up abruptly, his patience finally fraying. "So what, you're going to throw everything away and start over because you had a medical scare? That's not growth, Haze. That's panic." "Maybe, but at least it's my panic." After he left, slamming the door with just enough force to make his point without seeming abusive, Haze sank onto her couch and let herself cry for the first time since the hospital, not because she missed Trevor, but because standing up for herself was so much harder than she'd expected. The second obstacle
was financial. Haze had health insurance through the community center, but it was the kind of high-deductible plan that covered catastrophes while leaving patients responsible for significant out-of-pocket costs. The bills began arriving on Tuesday. Hospital fees, surgical fees, anesthesia fees, and a dozen other charges she didn't understand but couldn't afford to ignore. Her savings account, never robust to begin with, couldn't cover the $8,000 she owed after insurance. She found herself doing calculations at her kitchen table, surrounded by bills and bank statements, trying to figure out how to manage payments without destroying her credit or her ability to pay rent. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days helping teenagers navigate systems and bureaucracies, but she'd never had to manage a medical crisis alone. She had assumed, without ever thinking about it directly, that if something like this happened, her family would help. Not because they were generous, but because that's what families did. Except her family didn't even know the extent of her financial situation. They'd never asked about her salary, her benefits, or whether she could afford to live on her own. They'd simply accepted that she managed somehow, the same way they'd accepted that she always managed to handle everything else.
Wednesday brought the third obstacle, her family's response to her new boundaries. Lily called while Haze was reviewing payment plan options for the hospital bills. Her sister's voice carried its usual breezy confidence, as if the emergency surgery had been a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening crisis. "Hey, sis, I heard you had some kind of medical thing. Are you all better now?" "I had emergency surgery. My appendix almost burst." "Yikes, that sounds awful. But you're okay now, right?" Haze found herself studying her sister's question, parsing the casual dismissal embedded in the concern. "I'm recovering. It's been challenging." "Well, I'm glad you're better. Actually, I'm calling because I have some exciting news. You know that gallery in Soho that's been interested in my work? They want to give me a solo show in December." And just like that, they were back to the familiar dynamic. Haze's experience minimized and dismissed, while Lily's achievements took center stage. But this time, Haze noticed it happening. "That's great, Lily," she said, without the enthusiasm her sister was clearly expecting. "I was hoping you could help me with some of the logistics. You know how good you are at organizing things. I need someone to coordinate with the caterers, manage the guest list, handle the RSVPs. I can't do that." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that Haze wondered if the call had dropped. "What do you mean you can't do it?" "I mean, I can't manage your gallery opening. I'm still recovering from surgery, I'm dealing with medical bills, and I'm trying to figure out some things in my own life." "But it's just a few phone calls and emails. It's not like you're that busy." The assumption that her time and energy were infinitely available, that her own challenges were secondary to everyone else's opportunities, crystallized something for Haze. This was how it had always been. This was why she had been invisible in her own family. "Actually, I am that busy, and even if I weren't, I don't want to coordinate your gallery opening." "I don't understand what's gotten into you lately," Lily said, her voice taking on a petulant edge. "Mom said you were being difficult at the hospital, and now you're being weird with me." "Mom said I was being difficult?" "She said you were upset that they didn't drop everything to come to the hospital, as if they could have done anything to help." Haze felt something cold settle in her chest. Her mother had reframed her daughter's medical emergency as unreasonable neediness, and apparently the family had accepted that narrative without question? "I almost died, Lily." "But you didn't. You're fine. So what's the big deal?" The fourth obstacle came on Thursday in the form of well-meaning advice from people who thought they understood her situation, but had never lived it. Mrs. Chen from 2B knocked on her door with homemade soup and unsolicited counsel. "Family is family," the elderly woman said, settling into Haze's kitchen with the confidence of someone who had survived 8 decades and believed her experience gave her the right to dispense wisdom. "They might not be perfect, but they're the only family you have." Haze's coworker Sandra offered similar advice when she stopped by with groceries and gossip from the community center. Maybe they're just not good in crisis situations. Some people shut down when they're scared. Even Janet, who had become something of a surrogate mother figure over the years, urged caution when Haze mentioned her decision to create distance from her family. "I'm not saying they handled this right," Janet said during a phone call Friday evening, "but cutting people off entirely is a big step. Maybe there's a middle ground." The advice was kindly meant, but it missed the fundamental point. Haze wasn't cutting her family off in a moment of pique. She was simply acknowledging that they had never really been available to be cut off from. She was simply stopping the exhausting work of maintaining relationships that only existed because of her effort. The fifth and most unexpected obstacle was her own conditioning. 26 years of training herself to prioritize everyone else's needs didn't disappear overnight. She found herself reaching for her phone to call Marcus before remembering that he hadn't called her. She caught herself planning to make her mother's favorite dessert for the next family dinner before realizing she wasn't sure she wanted to attend. Most challenging of all was the guilt that crept in during quiet moments, the voice in her head that insisted she was being selfish, ungrateful, dramatic, the voice that sounded suspiciously like her mother's, telling her that expecting basic care and consideration from family was asking too much. By Friday night, Haze was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with her surgery. Creating boundaries, she was learning, was like exercising muscles that had never been used. It was necessary work, but it hurt. She was sitting on her couch, laptop open, as she researched graduate programs in counseling psychology, one of the promises she'd made to herself in the hospital bed, when her doorbell rang. Standing in her hallway was Marcus, her golden child older brother, holding a bottle of expensive wine and wearing the expression of someone who had come to fix a problem he didn't really understand. "We need to talk," he said, and Haze realized that the real obstacles were just beginning. Marcus Roberts stood in his sister's modest apartment doorway, and Haze could see him taking inventory. The secondhand furniture, the small kitchen, the stack of medical bills on her coffee table. His expression carried that particular mixture of condescension and obligation that she'd watched him perfect over the years. The look of someone who had come to solve a problem he considered beneath his usual concerns. "Nice place," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He moved into her living room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcome everywhere, setting the wine bottle on her counter without asking. "What do you want, Marcus?" "Can't I visit my sister without having an agenda? You've never visited me before, not once in the 4 years I've lived here." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, loosening his tie in a gesture that reminded her of their father. Marcus had always been Richard Roberts' son in every way that mattered, ambitious, successful, and utterly convinced that his achievements gave him the right to manage other people's lives. "Look, Mom told me you're upset about the hospital situation. I get it. Medical emergencies are scary and you felt alone, but you're turning this into something bigger than it needs to be." Haze remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest. Something about Marcus in her space felt invasive, like he was bringing the family dynamic into the one place where she'd begun to feel like herself. "What would be the appropriate size for this situation, Marcus? What's the correct amount of upset when your family can't be bothered to show up for emergency surgery? That's not fair, and you know it. We all had commitments. Dad was in Boston for the Morrison case. You know how important that client is. Mom had 3 closings that day. I was in meetings with potential investors. And Lily?" Marcus paused, clearly not having prepared an excuse for their youngest sister. "Lily is Lily. You know how she is with medical stuff. She gets squeamish." The casual dismissal of their sister's inability to handle crisis was so typically Robert's family that Haze almost laughed. They had explanations for everything, justifications that made their selfishness seem reasonable. "Do you know what it cost me to have that surgery, Marcus?" "What does that have to do with anything?" $8,000 after insurance. That's more than I make in 3 months. Marcus frowned, and she could see him doing quick calculations. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his sister's life operated under entirely different financial constraints than his own. Why didn't you say something? If money's an issue. Money isn't the issue. The issue is that none of you cared enough to be there. The issue is that I could have died and you all had better things to do. You didn't die. You're fine. I'm fine because I got lucky. Because Dr. Caldwell was skilled, and because my appendix held together just long enough. But what if it hadn't? What if the last conversation I'd had with Mom was about her real estate showings? What if you had to live with the fact that you chose investor meetings over your sister? Marcus sat down heavily on her couch, and for a moment he looked less like the golden child and more like what he was. A 30-year-old man who had never been forced to examine his own capacity for selfishness. What do you want from us, Haze? We can't change what happened. I want you to acknowledge what happened. I want you to admit that I wasn't a priority, that I've never been a priority, and that you're all okay with that as long as I don't complain about it. That's not true, isn't it? When's the last time any of you called just to see how I was doing? When's the last time you asked about my job, my life, what I cared about? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Haze could see him trying to remember. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of family dinners where she'd been the supporting cast, holidays where she'd been the coordinator rather than the celebrated guest, birthdays where her needs had been afterthoughts. We care about you, he said finally. Do you? Or do you care about me continuing to play the role I've always played, the one who organizes things and remembers details and doesn't cause problems? Look, maybe we've taken you for granted. I can admit that. But that doesn't mean we don't love you.
Love isn't a feeling, Marcus. It's actions. It's showing up. It's answering the phone when someone needs you. Over the next hour, they had the most honest conversation they'd ever had as adults. Marcus tried various approaches, defensiveness, minimization, promises to do better, but Haze had spent the past week learning to recognize manipulation, even when it came dressed as family concern. The thing is, she said as he prepared to leave, I don't think you're bad people. I think you're people who've never had to consider what it costs someone else to make your lives comfortable. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've spent 26 years managing everyone else's needs and emotions while pretending I didn't have any of my own, and you've all been happy to let me. After Marcus left, Haze felt emotionally drained, but also strangely clear. The conversation had confirmed what she had suspected. Her family wasn't going to change because they didn't see anything that needed changing. She was the problem for wanting more, for expecting reciprocity, for believing she deserved the same consideration they automatically gave each other. The next morning, she called Dr. Caldwell's office and asked for a referral to a therapist. I'm dealing with some family issues, she explained to the receptionist, and I think I need professional help figuring out how to navigate them. Dr. Rebecca Foster was nothing like what Haze had expected from a therapist. She was in her 50s with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, and she had the kind of directness that made pretense impossible. Tell me why you're here, Dr. Foster said during their first session. Haze found herself telling the whole story, the surgery, the empty hospital room, the family's reaction to her new boundaries. Dr. Foster listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, but mostly just paying attention in a way that felt foreign and valuable. What you're describing, Dr. Foster said when Haze finished, sounds like a family system that has relied on your compliance and emotional labor to function. When you withdraw that labor, the system gets disrupted. Is that why everyone's so angry with me? People get angry when their coping mechanisms stop working. Your family have been coping with their own inability to show up emotionally by relying on you to handle the emotional work for all of them. Over the following weeks, Haze began to understand the complex dynamics she'd been navigating her entire life.
She learned about enmeshment and parentification, about how children and dysfunctional families often become emotional caretakers for the adults who should be caring for them. The question, Dr. Foster said during their 4th session, is what you want to do with this information. Meanwhile, Haze was applying the same energy she'd always devoted to other people's problems to figuring out her own life. She researched graduate programs seriously for the first time, looking at schools in other states, programs that would take her far from the family dynamics that had shaped her for so long. She also began to build the kind of support system she'd never realized she needed. Janet had become a genuine friend, not just a supervisor. Some of the parents from the community center had started including her in social gatherings. She'd even joined a hiking group that met on Saturday mornings, discovering that she loved the physical challenge and the camaraderie of people working toward a shared goal. The most surprising development was her growing relationship with Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor. What had started as casual hallway conversations had evolved into weekly coffee dates, where Mrs. Chen shared stories of surviving the Cultural Revolution and building a life in America, while Haze talked about her own, smaller but no less significant revolution. Family is important, Mrs. Chen said one Saturday afternoon, but chosen family is sometimes more important. Blood doesn't make people love you correctly. 3 weeks after Marcus' visit, Haze received a text from her mother, "Sunday dinner at 2 p.m. We need to discuss this family situation you've created." The presumption in the message was breathtaking, that she had created a family situation by refusing to pretend that medical abandonment was acceptable. But it was also illuminating. Her mother still believed that Haze would show up, would comply, would return to her designated role if only the family applied enough pressure. For the first time in her life, Haze typed back, "No, thank you." Her mother's response was immediate. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I won't be coming to Sunday dinner." "Don't be ridiculous. We're family." She stared at her phone for a long moment, thinking about Dr. Foster's words about family systems and emotional labor. Then she typed, "Being family means showing up for each other. When I needed you to show up, you didn't. Now I'm choosing not to show up for you." She turned off her phone and went for a walk in the Hartford neighborhood she was finally learning to call home. The call came on a Thursday morning in November, 3 weeks after Haze had declined her mother's Sunday dinner invitation and begun what felt like the first authentic chapter of her adult life. She was at the community center, helping 16-year-old Jasmine Williams prepare her college application essays, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. "Haze Roberts?" "Yes, this is Haze." "This is Dr. Amanda Pierce from Hartford Hospital. I'm calling about your father, Richard Roberts. He's been admitted with a heart attack, and you're listed as one of his emergency contacts." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Despite everything that had happened, despite the emotional distance she'd been creating, the thought of losing her father hit her like a physical blow. How bad is it? "He's stable right now, but it was significant. We'll know more in the next few hours. Your mother is here, and she asked us to call you." Haze found herself grabbing her keys and explaining to Janet that she had to leave, her body moving on autopilot while her mind raced. This was the test she hadn't prepared for. What happened to her new boundaries when there was a real crisis, when someone's life hung in the balance? The drive to Hartford Hospital felt like traveling through a time warp, each mile taking her backward toward the family dynamics she'd been working so hard to escape. By the time she reached the cardiac unit, her carefully constructed emotional walls were crumbling. She found her mother in the family waiting area, looking smaller and more fragile than Haze had ever seen her. Victoria Roberts, who had built her identity on being perfectly put together, sat hunched in a plastic chair with smeared mascara and wrinkled clothes. "Oh, Haze," Victoria said, standing to embrace her daughter. "Thank God you came." For a moment, Haze allowed herself to melt into her mother's arms, to feel needed and wanted in the way she'd craved her entire life. This was what she'd always imagined family could be. People coming together in crisis, supporting each other through the worst moments. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, his usual corporate confidence replaced by genuine fear. Lily showed up an hour after that, tearful and dramatic, but undeniably present.
For the first time in months, the Roberts family was all in the same place, united by something larger than their individual agendas. The doctor said it was a major heart attack, Victoria explained, her voice shaky. He was in a client meeting and he just collapsed. If his assistant hadn't called 911 immediately, the unspoken possibility hung in the air between them. They could have lost him. They could have lost their father without warning, without preparation, without the chance to say goodbye. Over the next several hours, Haze found herself slipping back into familiar patterns. She was the one who spoke to the nurses, who kept track of medical updates, who made sure her mother ate something and stayed hydrated. She coordinated with the hospital social worker, researched cardiac rehabilitation programs, and handled the dozen practical details that crisis required. It felt natural, almost inevitable. This was who she was in her family, the competent one, the caretaker, the problem solver. And for the first time since her appendectomy, her family seemed genuinely grateful for her presence. "I don't know what we'd do without you," her mother said on Friday evening as they maintained their vigil in the cardiac unit. "You're so good at handling these situations." Marcus nodded his agreement. "You always know what questions to ask the doctors. Mom and I just panic, but you stay calm." Even Lily, usually wrapped up in her own concerns, seemed to recognize her sister's value. "I'm so glad you're here, Haze. I wouldn't know how to navigate any of this medical stuff." The praise felt like a drug after months of feeling invisible and unappreciated. Here was proof that she mattered, that her family needed her, that her role as the emotional caretaker wasn't just something she'd imposed on herself, but something genuinely necessary. Dr. Foster had warned her about this during their last session. Crisis has a way of pulling us back into old patterns. When people are scared and vulnerable, they often revert to whatever roles felt safe before, even if those roles were ultimately harmful. But sitting in the hospital waiting room, watching her mother's genuine relief when she handled insurance questions and coordinated with Richard's office, Haze began to doubt the progress she'd been making. Maybe she had been overreacting about the appendectomy. Maybe families just handled crisis differently, and she'd been too harsh in her judgments. Richard's surgery went well, and by Saturday afternoon, he was awake and stable. The cardiac surgeon, Dr. Reynolds, explained that while the heart attack had been serious, Richard's prognosis was good if he committed to significant lifestyle changes. No more 16-hour workdays, Dr. Reynolds told the assembled family. He needs to reduce stress, improve his diet, and start exercising regularly. This was a warning, but it's one he can recover from if he takes it seriously. As the immediate crisis passed, Haze expected her family to return to their normal patterns of neglect and self-absorption. Instead, something different happened. They began to rely on her more heavily than ever before.
Victoria, overwhelmed by the prospect of managing Richard's recovery, turned to Haze for everything from meal planning to medical appointment scheduling. "You're so much better at organizing than I am," she said, "and you understand all this medical terminology." Marcus, facing the reality that his father might need to scale back his law practice, wanted Haze to research home health services and rehabilitation facilities. "You have experience with this kind of thing through your work, right? You know what to look for." Lily, terrified by the reminder of mortality, needed constant emotional support and reassurance. "I keep thinking about what if he had died," she would say, calling Haze at all hours. "I don't think I could handle losing him." Within a week, Haze found herself more enmeshed in her family's life than she'd been since high school. She was at her parents' house every day after work, coordinating care, managing appointments, and providing the emotional labor that kept everyone else functioning. The community center began to suffer from her divided attention. She missed a meeting with potential donors, arrived late to several programs, and found herself too exhausted to give her usual energy to the teenagers who depended on her. "Are you okay, Janet?" asked during their weekly supervision meeting. "You seem overwhelmed." "My father had a heart attack. I'm just trying to help my family get through it." "Of course, but remember, helping doesn't mean taking on everyone else's responsibilities. Your family has other resources." Janet's gentle reminder stung because it echoed what Dr. Foster had been trying to teach her. But when Haze looked at her mother's exhaustion and her siblings' obvious panic, The therapeutic insights felt academic and cold. The breaking point came 2 weeks after Richard's surgery. Haze had been at the hospital for a follow-up appointment, then spent the afternoon at her parents' house organizing medications and preparing meals for the week. She was exhausted, behind on her own responsibilities, and beginning to resent the very family she'd been working so hard to support. When she finally arrived home at 9 p.m., she found Trevor waiting outside her apartment building. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. "I'm tired, Trevor. Can this wait?" "I've been thinking about what you said, about priorities and showing up for people, and you're right. I should have been there when you needed me." Despite everything, Haze felt a flutter of hope. Maybe Trevor had genuinely learned something from their breakup. Maybe he was capable of the growth she'd thought impossible. "I want to try again," he continued. "I want to prove that I can be the partner you deserve. Trevor, but I also think you need to look at yourself. You say I didn't prioritize you, but look at what you're doing now. Your dad has a heart attack, and suddenly your family is the center of your universe again. You're right back to putting everyone else first." The observation hit her like a slap. Not because it was cruel, but because it contained enough truth to be devastating. That's different. He almost died. Is it different, or is this just another version of you sacrificing yourself so other people don't have to deal with uncomfortable emotions? Haze stared at him, realizing that Trevor, manipulative, self-absorbed Trevor, had identified the trap she'd walked straight into. In trying to prove she was a good daughter during her father's crisis, she'd abandoned every boundary she'd worked to establish. That night, lying in bed exhausted and confused, Haze admitted to herself what she'd been trying to avoid. She was lost. 3 months after her appendectomy had shown her the truth about her relationships, she was more tangled up in dysfunctional patterns than ever before. She thought she was strong enough to maintain her boundaries under pressure, but the first real test had revealed how fragile her progress really was. Worse, she was beginning to doubt whether change was even possible, or if she was destined to repeat these patterns forever. For the first time since her appendectomy, Haze wondered if fighting for herself was worth the cost.
The wake-up call came not through dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, but through the quiet exhaustion of a 17-year-old girl named Amara Johnson, who sat across from Haze in the community center's counseling room on a gray December afternoon. "You seem different, Miss Roberts," Amara said, studying Haze with the kind of perceptiveness that teenagers possessed when adults thought they weren't paying attention. "Like distracted or something." Haze looked up from the college application they'd been reviewing, struck by the irony that one of her students was calling her out for being emotionally absent. Over the past month, since her father's heart attack, she'd been going through the motions at work while pouring all her actual energy into managing her family's crisis. "I'm sorry, Amara. You deserve my full attention. Let's focus on your essay." "Nah, it's cool. I get it." Amara leaned back in her chair, her expression wise beyond her 17 years. "My mom did the same thing when my grandma got sick. Turned herself inside out trying to take care of everyone else, forgot she was a person too. What happened? Grandma got better, but Mom didn't. She was so burned out she couldn't function for months. Had to go stay with my aunt just to remember who she was when she wasn't taking care of somebody." The parallel hit Haze with uncomfortable clarity. Here was a teenager who understood family dysfunction better than Haze had at 26, who could see patterns that Haze had been blind to her entire life. "Amara, can I ask you something? How do you know when helping someone becomes hurting yourself?" "When you start forgetting you matter too," Amara said without hesitation. "When you're so busy fixing everyone else's problems that you can't even see your own anymore." That evening, Haze sat in her apartment and took inventory of what her life had become. She hadn't been to therapy in 3 weeks, claiming she was too busy managing her father's recovery. She'd missed 2 hiking group meetings and had barely spoken to Janet except about work logistics. Her own graduate school application sat untouched on her desk, deadlines approaching, while she spent her evenings researching heart-healthy recipes and coordinating her father's medical appointments. Most tellingly, she felt like a stranger in her own life again, the same feeling that had driven her to make changes after her appendectomy.
All her progress, all her hard-won insights about boundaries and self-worth had dissolved the moment her family needed her to be their emotional caretaker again. The next morning, Haze called Dr. Foster's office and scheduled an emergency session. "I think I've undone everything," she said, settling into the familiar chair in Dr. Foster's office. "My dad had a heart attack, and I went right back to being the family problem solver. I can't seem to help myself." "Tell me what that looks like," Dr. Foster said. For the next hour, Haze detailed how completely she'd been consumed by her family's needs. The daily visits, the appointment scheduling, the emotional management of her mother's anxiety and Lily's fears. She described how natural it had felt, how grateful they had been, and how much she'd missed feeling essential to their functioning. "What you're describing isn't unusual," Dr. Foster said when Haze finished. "Many people find that crisis pulls them back into familiar patterns, even when those patterns are harmful. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I don't know. Part of me thinks maybe this is just who I am. Maybe I was wrong to try to change." "Let me ask you something. If your father has another medical emergency 5 years from now, how do you want to handle it?" The question caught Haze off guard. She'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't considered the long-term implications of her choices. "I want to be able to help without losing myself," she said slowly. "Then you need to figure out the difference between supporting someone and enabling a dysfunctional system." That night, Haze been something she'd never done before. She made a list of what she'd been doing for her family versus what they could reasonably do for themselves. Her father needed medical care and emotional support during recovery. Her mother needed help understanding insurance and treatment options. These were legitimate needs that any loving family member might help address. But her family also expected her to manage all their anxiety about the situation, to handle every practical detail so they didn't have to feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed, and to be available for every emotional crisis or minor inconvenience. They wanted her to absorb their stress so they could function normally, and they had convinced her that this was what family loyalty looked like.
The breakthrough came on Saturday morning during what should have been a routine visit to her parents' house. Haze arrived to find chaos. Her mother in tears because she'd confused 2 of her father's medications, Lily having a panic attack about whether their father might have another heart attack, and Marcus on the phone yelling at an insurance representative about a billing error. "Thank God you're here," Victoria said, immediately expecting Haze to solve all 3 problems simultaneously. For a moment, Haze felt the familiar pull to spring into action, to fix everything, to make everyone comfortable. But then she noticed something that stopped her cold. Her father, supposedly the patient who needed care and support, sitting calmly in his chair reading the newspaper, completely unaffected by the chaos surrounding him. He wasn't participating in the crisis management. He wasn't soothing his wife's anxiety or his daughter's panic. He wasn't dealing with the insurance problem or the medication confusion. He was reading the sports section while everyone else flailed around trying to manage his life for him. "Dad," Haze said, interrupting the family pandemonium, "are you okay?" Richard looked up from his paper, surprised to be addressed directly. "I'm fine. Why?" "Mom is upset about your medications, Lily is worried about your health, and Marcus is fighting with insurance on your behalf, but you seem completely unbothered by any of it." "Well, I figure you all will sort it out." The casual assumption in his statement hit her like lightning. He figured they would sort it out. Not that he would participate in managing his own medical care, not that he would help solve the problems his condition had created, but that the women in his family would handle the emotional and practical labor while he remained comfortable and uninvolved. "Actually, no," Haze said, her voice steady but firm. "I won't be sorting it out." The room went quiet. Victoria stopped crying mid-sob. Lily's hyperventilating paused. Marcus ended his phone call. "What do you mean?" Victoria asked. "I mean that Dad is a grown man who is perfectly capable of managing his own medication schedule and insurance issues, and the rest of you are adults who can handle your own anxiety about his health without expecting me to absorb it for you." "But you're so much better at this stuff," Lily started. No, I'm not. I'm just willing to do it so you don't have to. But that doesn't mean I should. Haze looked around the room at her family, really looked at them, and saw something she'd never noticed before. They weren't helpless. They weren't incapable. They were comfortable with dysfunction because it meant they didn't have to do the hard work of taking care of themselves. Dad, you're going to call the insurance company yourself and resolve that billing issue. Mom, you're going to sit down with Dad and organize his medications together as partners. Lily, you're going to find a therapist to help you process your anxiety about mortality instead of calling me at midnight every time you have a scary thought. You can't just abandon us during a family crisis, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he'd always used to shut down dissent. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm refusing to enable a system where I do all the emotional work so the rest of you can avoid growing up. That's a terrible thing to say, Victoria protested. What's terrible is that I've spent 26 years believing that my value in this family depended on how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice. What's terrible is that none of you have ever asked what I need or want, only what I can do for you. The conversation that followed was brutal. Her family cycled through every manipulation tactic in their arsenal: guilt, anger, accusations, and promises to change that felt hollow because they came only in response to her withdrawal of services. But something had shifted inside Haze. She could see the patterns now not as inevitable family dynamics, but as choices everyone was making. Her family chose to remain helpless because it was easier than being responsible. They chose to rely on her emotional labor because it meant they didn't have to develop their own coping skills. And she could choose differently. I love all of you, Haze said as she prepared to leave, but I love myself too, and I'm not going to keep pretending that I don't matter. As she drove away from her parents' house, Haze felt something she'd never experienced before. The peace that came from acting in alignment with her own values, even when it disappointed other people. That afternoon, she submitted her applications for graduate school. That evening, she called Janet and asked for Monday morning off to attend her therapy session. That night, she wrote in the journal Dr. Foster had recommended not just what had happened, but how it felt to finally choose herself. The transformation wasn't complete. She knew there would be more challenges, more pressure from her family, more moments when she'd be tempted to fall back into old patterns. But she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. She'd learned the difference between loving people and losing herself in the process. For the first time in her life, Haze Roberts knew who she was when she wasn't trying to be what everyone else needed.
6 months later, Haze Roberts stood in Dr. Patricia Caldwell's office at Mercy General Hospital, no longer as a patient, but as a volunteer coordinator for the hospital's new family support program. The spring sunshine streamed through the windows of the same medical facility where her transformation had begun, but everything about her presence there was different now. I have to admit, when I first met you, I was worried, Dr. Caldwell said, reviewing the program proposal Haze had submitted. You seemed like someone who had never learned to advocate for herself. Now look at you, creating a program to help other people navigate exactly what you went through. The family support program had been Haze's idea, born from her own experience of facing medical crisis without adequate support. The program would train volunteers to help patients whose families were absent, overwhelmed, or simply unable to provide the emotional and practical assistance that medical emergencies required. I kept thinking about how different my recovery might have been if I'd had someone to explain what was happening, to help me understand my options, to just sit with me so I wasn't alone, Haze said. Not someone to fix everything, but someone to remind me that I deserved care and support. Dr. Caldwell signed the approval forms with a smile. When do you want to start training volunteers? Next month, if possible. I've already identified 12 people who are interested, including 3 former patients who went through similar experiences. As Haze left the hospital, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying night when she'd been rushed to the same building, desperately calling family members who wouldn't answer their phones. The scared, people-pleasing woman who had prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own survival felt like a character from someone else's story. The changes hadn't been easy or immediate. After her confrontation with her family in December, there had been weeks of attempted guilt trips, manipulation, and family meetings designed to pressure her back into her old role. Marcus had tried leveraging their father's health, insisting that stress from family conflict could trigger another heart attack. Victoria had alternated between tearful phone calls about how Haze was destroying the family and cold silence designed to punish her for setting boundaries. Lily had been the most persistent, calling at all hours with fabricated emergencies and dramatic pronouncements about how much she needed her sister's support. It had taken Haze weeks to learn to distinguish between genuine crises and manufactured chaos designed to pull her back into caretaking mode. But Haze had held firm, supported by the therapy work she'd committed to and the new support system she'd built around herself. Dr. Foster had helped her develop scripts for dealing with family pressure, strategies for maintaining boundaries without cutting off all contact, and, most importantly, tools for recognizing her own worth independent of other people's approval. The breakthrough had come in February, when her father had actually taken responsibility for managing his recovery. Without Haze available to coordinate his care, Richard had been forced to engage with his own medical needs. He'd started attending cardiac rehabilitation classes, modified his diet, and even begun taking evening walks with Victoria, activities that had strengthened their marriage in ways that Haze's caretaking never could have. "You know," he'd said during a rare phone conversation in March, "I think I was using your help as an excuse not to deal with my own health. It was easier to let you handle everything than to face how scared I was." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement. The first time his father had recognized how the family dynamics had affected everyone, including him. The most surprising change had been with Marcus. Without Haze managing family logistics and emotions, he'd been forced to step into a more active role with their parents. The experience had given him a new appreciation for the work Haze had been doing invisibly for years. "I never realized how much you were handling," he'd admitted during a coffee meeting in April. "I always thought you just liked organizing things, that it came naturally to you. I didn't understand that it was work, and that you were doing it instead of us." These conversations had led to a tentative reconstruction of their relationships, built on more honest foundations. Haze had learned to participate in family events without becoming the default coordinator. She attended her father's birthday dinner in May, but she didn't plan the menu, handle the reservations, or manage everyone else's emotions about the milestone. She simply showed up as a daughter, not as the family's emotional labor force.
The most dramatic change had been professional. Haze had been accepted into the Master's in Clinical Psychology program at Southern Connecticut State University, with classes beginning in the fall. The acceptance letter had arrived on the same day she'd submitted her hospital volunteer program proposal, a convergence that felt like the universe confirming her new direction. Janet had been incredibly supportive of the transition, helping Haze arrange a part-time schedule that would allow her to continue working at the community center while pursuing her degree. "You're going to be an amazing therapist," Janet had told her. "You have the rare combination of empathy and boundaries that this field needs." The community center kids had also played a crucial role in her transformation. Watching teenagers like Amara and Jasmine advocate for themselves with courage she was still developing had inspired Haze to keep pushing forward, even when change felt impossible. "You taught us that we deserve better than what we've been settling for," Jasmine had said during their last counseling session before graduation. "Now you're finally taking your own advice." Perhaps the most profound change was in Haze's relationship with herself. She'd learned to enjoy her own company, to pursue interests without needing external validation, and to make decisions based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. She joined a photography class and discovered a genuine talent for capturing moments of urban beauty. abandoned lots transformed by wildflowers, elderly couples sharing benches in city parks, children finding joy in the simplest activities. Her apartment walls now displayed her own work alongside the thank you cards from the community center kids, creating a visual story of a life lived authentically. She'd also learned to date differently. After months of being single and focusing on her own growth, she'd met David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, at a community garden volunteer day. David was a social worker who understood the demands of helping others without losing yourself in the process. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than convenience or the need to fill an emotional void. "I like that you have your own life," David had told her, after they'd been dating for 3 months. "I can support you without having to complete you." The contrast with her relationship with Trevor couldn't have been more stark. Where Trevor had wanted a girlfriend who would adapt to his schedule and priorities, David appreciated a partner who had her own goals and boundaries. As summer approached, Haze found herself in a position she'd never imagined, genuinely happy with her life and excited about her future. The family drama that had once consumed her thoughts had become background noise, manageable but no longer defining. The final piece of her transformation came in the form of a letter, not an email or text, but an actual handwritten note from her mother, arriving on a Tuesday in June. "Dear Haze," it began. "I've been thinking about everything that happened this past year, and I realize I owe you an apology. Not for the hospital, though I'm sorry about that too, but for all the years I let you take care of everyone without ever asking what you needed. I told myself you were just naturally good at it, but I think I knew I was asking too much, and I chose not to see it because it made my life easier. I'm proud of the woman you've become, even though I wish it hadn't taken almost losing you for me to notice how strong you are. Love, Mom." Haze read the letter 3 times, crying openly by the 3rd reading, not because it erased the hurt or magically fixed their relationship, but because it represented something she'd never thought possible. Her mother seeing her as a complete person worthy of consideration and respect. 2 weeks later, Haze received her first assignment for graduate school, a paper on family systems therapy. As she researched the topic that had become her lived experience, she realized that her story was far from over. She was just beginning to understand the ripple effects of choosing herself, the ways that one person's healing could influence entire family systems, communities, and future generations. On a warm evening in July, exactly 9 months after her emergency surgery, Haze sat in her apartment working on graduate school preparations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amara, now thriving in her first year at Central Connecticut State University. "Thanks for teaching me that asking for help isn't the same as asking someone to carry your whole life for you. Hope you're still taking your own advice." Haze smiled, looking around her apartment, truly her space now, filled with evidence of a life lived intentionally rather than reactively. She had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but she knew with certainty that she would meet them as herself, not as the person everyone needed her to be. The girl who had once nearly died alone in a hospital room had become a woman who would never be truly alone again, because she had finally learned to show up for herself with the same dedication she'd once reserved for everyone else. Her journey was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.